Hello, class. Welcome to the section of the World War I unit. Kind of starting with this map, you can see that World War I, it was largely a war between European powers. So though this is called a world war, that doesn't start to really be the case beyond some small colonial conflicts until countries like the United States get involved, which they did at the beginning of 1917. So this is just again give you some context. You've got your Eastern Front, where the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans tend to win, and the Western Front over here between France and Germany, which tends to be a stalemate. So at home, you've got the U.S., citizenry wondering why do we get involved in this war? And so, in spite of those questions, this war, regardless of what anyone wanted, really changed how American society was constructed. So the question in this section is, how did the war change American society? This is a political cartoon of President Woodrow Wilson, who you can see if you look at. I'll set up the. Where is it? No, that's not it. There it is, the pointer. You can see up here, vote for Wilson, who kept you out of war. 1916, Woodrow Wilson's campaign promise was kept America out of war. This global war, why get involved? And so he really kind of hung his hat politically on this. Down below, bringing it home, President Wilson, what's that? U-boat blockading New York? Tut tut, how inopportune. So Wilson was the first president in American history who ever got elected, and I actually want to say the last president with a PhD. He was president of Princeton University down in New Jersey, and was seen as kind of a stuffed shirt, an intellectual type. And so this is a joke saying, oh, how inconvenient to have the war come to home. So how did the war change American society? Well, one really kind of basic thing is that American society found itself at war. So once the U.S. got involved in World War I, it was a complete change in the way the government was structured in particular. So two big pieces. I'm going to go into more detail on the first one on the next couple of slides, and then explain this image right here. So the first detail is the Congress passed the Selective Service Act, which is still on the books. What the Selective Service Act is a kind of legalese name for the draft. There were the draft was all men between the ages of 18 and 30, and this ends up being 24 million men by the end of the war. Even though 24 million men are, and this, yes, it excluded women. This was passed before women had the right to vote as well. 4.8 million served. There were also volunteers of roughly the same number. So about 8 million American soldiers fought in World War I, either at the front lines or behind the front lines. Congress, in addition to creating the first draft in American history since the Civil War, also established this really important, largely forgotten board. So Congress passes a law. They created an executive branch department under the power of Woodrow Wilson. These gentlemen in the picture are the members of this board. It's called the War Industries Board. And what it does is it takes over the U.S. economy. It is, I refer to it as full-on state socialism. And what I mean is the head of the board, Bernard Baruch, who's the guy here, most powerful man in the entire country, could set the prices of goods. He could tell factories what to produce, and he could tell the railroads where to bring it and who to bring it to. And if that isn't socialism, which is, again, government or the people controlling an element of the economy, I don't know what is. And you can also see you've got admirals, generals, and these other folks are leaders of some of the largest banks. I think this is Mellon, like Carnegie Mellon University. So wealthiest men in the country, the military, all tied together. And there's a good reason for it, because an uncontrolled economy ended up being a disaster in the first couple days of the war. There was a train pile up in Chicago, not a crash, but it was like a train traffic jam that lasted a month. And then basically everybody in the East Coast couldn't get coal, which is what this is. So Chicago's right here. All the coal from the western part of the country going to the east couldn't get through because the U.S. is involved in the war. So basically there was a shutdown of industry in order to make it so people in New England and the other northern states didn't freeze to death in the winter, because the War Industries Board hadn't been created and the government wasn't controlling the economy. So in short, this draft, men get drafted, and the government takes over the entire economy to make it run more efficiently, which it does. They are able to coordinate the way out of this traffic jam. You can think about it in this way. A private company is going to send their coal, for example, to the place where it's going to make them the most money, not taking into account there may be, I don't know, 100,000 American troops passing through on trains through Chicago or something like that. And so there wouldn't be room. So these are different classes of the draft. In short, if you're over 18 and you're healthy, you're going to get drafted. So the most likely and most common group was unmarried registrants with no dependents. So you're not married, you have no kids. Or if you're married and your spouse has a job, which is common enough, or kids who are also working in factories, you could get drafted. So basically, I'm not going to go through all of this. The more hardship it would cause you or your family, less you and more your family. Or like this one right here, if you're a farmer, then you might end up continuing to be in the war. So these are a couple propaganda posters from the British Army, obviously. And so one of the ways you could persuade people to join the military, if you weren't going to draft them, and both the United States and Great Britain started off the war without a peacetime draft, is you can try to persuade them. So these are what are called propaganda posters, and they try to persuade you using basically 3 different elements of argumentation. So when you write a focus question, you're trying to persuade your reader this statement I'm making is true. And you're trying to do it mostly by facts, sometimes by, citing a source that's reliable or by playing on people's heartstrings. Britons. Who are the Britons? That's you. They're trying to get an emotional response. They've got the guy pointing at you. Britons. This is, I think, Lord something or other. Lord Chittenden or something like that. Wants you. Join your country's army. God save the king. So it's meant to play on your emotional heartstrings. Your country's army. God save the king. So there's patriotism involved there. Who's absent? Ooh, man. You got John Bull, the personification of Great Britain, pointing right at you if you don't join the military. American versions of this. Sentiment of every American mother. America here's my boy, and she's just taking this mannequin of a man and sending him off to war. Also, there's an element here where, is this what most women look like in the time period? No. Turn your silver into bullets at the post office. Really well done. They're, silver coins. They're not literally turning into bullets, but you're donating, basically giving money to the government to buy weapons. This is a money drive, basically. This one plays off of racism. Also, the movie King Kong. So you've got militarism on the monkey's hat, which is one of our causes of World War I. And he is German. You can tell by his little mustache. You've got this woman here, American, womanhood or whatever it might be. Destroy this mad brute, enlist. And then he's got the word culture. German culture is bad and evil. So you've got dehumanization of the enemy, which, makes it so people have an emotional reaction that isn't logical. You've got racism, frankly, like the whole idea of monkeys basically like attacking and raping white women is a whole racist trope, and then that gets tied into racism against African Americans and all that. And again, just the persuasive element, destroy this mad brute. There's a call to action. You can save this woman from King Kong. Oh, and they were tying into popular culture. So you have a movie, they try to persuade people to go join the military, which has nothing to do with fighting monkeys, by using that element of society. This is one of the more kind of positive examples of propaganda. So is the Seeds of Victory, plant and raise your own vegetables. This woman's Lady America here, she's sowing seeds in a field. Every garden a munition plant. So if you, as an individual American, grow a garden in your yard, that's resources that don't have to be spent on a farm, say in the Midwest, growing food for you. And then therefore, that farmer in the Midwest not growing food for you can then go work in a factory to make bombs for the war effort. So, all that being said, there's plenty of opposition to the war. Conscientious objection is one of your vocab terms in this section, and it's basically the idea that war, if you believe war is wrong, you have the moral right to be able to object to it. This was true from the very beginning of this country. The Quaker religious sect in Pennsylvania, the founding group there, were anti-war. And so they were able to get out of service in wars. They would serve as medics, things like that, or just simply not at all, behind the front lines. In World War I, if you look at the propaganda we just saw, it's pretty clear why that kind of viewpoint would be treated with suspicion. Many women, in fact, most women, were probably against the idea of war. And they tried to make the argument, well, there would be no wars if women just had the right to vote. Others, like socialists, who were becoming more politically prominent in this time period, believed that war was not worth spilling blood and treasure over because they believed that all wars were imperialist, which they were right in the case of World War I, at least. This gentleman is Eugene Debs. He was the former head of the Railway Workers Union and the first socialist candidate for president starting in, I think, 1896. He's given a speech basically against the war. It is, in fact, I believe this speech here, I think this one's in Chicago, or perhaps that's New Haven based on the sign, where he gets arrested for seditious speech, which we'll get to in a second. So here's Eugene Debs. He is, the first, again, socialist candidate for president. He got 6 million votes sitting in a prison cell. And again, the only reason he got arrested is because he was thrown into prison. Here are his I think this is 1914. And here's his 1918 campaign button. Social candidate for president, workers of the world unite. Old Karl Marx slogan right there. For president, convict 9653. This is Mark Ruffalo reading the Eugene Debs speech that got him arrested. It's worth watching. I'm not going to make you do it right now. So, all this nasty propaganda, getting people whipped up to a frenzy against Germans. So, long story short, there was about a third of America spoke German at the time of the American Revolution. About 10-15% spoke German as their first language at the dawn of World War I. And the xenophobic, meaning anti-foreign reaction, you can see this, keep the Hun out. This isn't even a person, it's a Hun. By home protection, the Huns are going to invade. Look at the blood on the knife. And so people speaking German were beat up. Dachshunds were murdered. Like, people drowned German dogs. German shepherds became known as, I think it's Alsatian shepherds. You've got German language used to be the most taught language in schools. Gone. Now it's just French and Spanish and Latin. So dachshunds become Liberty pups. Hamburgers is Liberty steak. Sauerkraut, Liberty cabbage. German measles is Liberty measles. If you guys have read 1984, this is Orwellian, meaning it's meant to brainwash people effectively into thinking Germans are evil. So women during the war, it's a really broad category, half the population. So many, 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 many women fought for their political rights, especially the right to suffrage. So this is still the progressive era. So we talked in the last unit, progressive era, people were fighting for various rights. Still the same time period, it's just the war is happening. Many women worked in factories where men had left, to go and serve in the military or be drafted in the military. Many were continuing on roles they'd already been serving in, as far as working in factories. So this is folks sorting bullet casings. That's what this image is, by the way. These are women sorting bullet casings for the war effort. Even Woodrow Wilson, who was a wicked sexist, was forced to acknowledge that women were vital to winning the war. The women in the suffrage movement put this all over their banners. And the evidence that this was effective, so the U.S. had pretty much a 1-to-1 replacement of male factory workers by female ones as soon as they went off to war. Compared to Germany, the U.S. produced nearly twice as much domestically, meaning, in their factories for the war effort per, factory as the Germans did, who didn't allow women to work in factories. So long story short, being sexist is bad for the economy, even if it's, you don't care about it being the morally right thing. So, again, how did this war affect American culture? It changed where people lived, in particular, African Americans. So the land of hope for Southern blacks is the industrial Northeast. There's plenty of factory jobs, there's less discrimination, and there's a potential for a future that doesn't involve a semi-slavery system like the sharecropping system down south. The reason this great migration of African Americans from the south to the north is the reason, period, that there are African Americans in the large cities in the Northeast and the Midwest. And it's because those are the good places to go to. Springfield, Mass. had the Springfield Armory. So you get thousands of African Americans moving up from the, Virginia, Maryland, into cities like Springfield or Boston or Fall River or New Bedford. And so total, it's 1.2 million blacks moved from the rural South to the urban North. They bring their culture and importantly, their music as well, which eventually evolves into music like jazz and then rock and roll, and then eventually in the modern era, kind of R&B and rap. And so this is, you want to talk about American culture. The Great Migration is the great mixing. So you can see kind of geographically, uh, East Coast, it's largely African Americans from the East Coast, Georgia on north. If you live in a city like Chicago, their African American community there has a slight southern Mississippi twang. Texas, go to the west. Same idea, just kind of showing it with numbers. So giving various cities and the growth in a mere 10 years, largely driven by World War One. So the Great Migration begins before World War One, but accelerates is because of the war. The last thing here, Hispanic immigration. So before the Mexican-American War, the 6 states in the West, California, basically to New Mexico and Texas, have been Spanish-speaking. With the victory of the U.S. in the Mexican-American War in the 1830s, many folks had fled or been forced out by white settlers. This flow reversed in the 1920s, and it was in fact invited. So you have a ban on Chinese immigration in the U.S. in the 1880s. There is actually an invitation for as much Mexican immigration as possible to go work on farms in California. So you end up with neighborhoods that are largely Latin speaking or Latin language speaking, so Spanish, Portuguese. And these barrios, or neighborhoods, which is what the word barrio means, are formed in cities like Los Angeles, which is what you're looking at right here. So there are still large areas of the city of Los Angeles in the Central Valley of California that are majority Spanish speaking because of this, I guess I could call it this other great migration. And that's that.